2 mothers were found who had got their babies circumcised, their baby boys circumcised. And the babies were hung around the mother's neck and then mothers' necks, and the mothers were thrown off the city walls head first down to their death. It was an astonishing and horrible time for the Jewish people. It was impossible to remain safe in the cities. And so the faithful had to flee the cities, had to live in caves and holes in a mountain in the rock, because only there they could be safe from the house to house, intense persecution going on. We read about this actually in Hebrews 11, as it describes the heroes of the faith. It describes these people who didn't give up on their faith despite paying such a heavy price. Hebrews 11 verse 35. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others had trials of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. There's a story of one mother called Hannah, who had 7 sons, and they were caught and were brought before Antiochus. And the sons were asked, one after another, to eat food sacrificed to an idol, to compromise their faith, and to become part of the worship of this new religion that had been imposed. The first son refused, and he was tortured and killed before the rest of the family. And then the second son was asked. He too refused, and he too was tortured and killed. And it went on like that from son to son. One of the sons said, well, I have received this body from on high, and I'm glad I give it back. Glad I give it back to him who gave me life. Finally, the youngest son was asked. He was just a young lad, and Antiochus had pity on him and said, just compromise. It's okay. We'll give you riches. We'll make you a special friend of the king. We'll give you a position of honor. Just have a little bit of this food sacrifice, this idol. Just make it look like you have changed your allegiance. But he refused, and he spoke boldly, and he said, I might go to my destruction, but ultimately you will face the destruction of God. And he too was killed. And the mother said, well, Abraham sacrificed his one son. I have sacrificed 7. It was a time of great testing, a time where those who were really going to follow the Lord had to stand up and be counted, and had to choose individually, were they willing to pay the price. Ultimately, it was a battle for the worship of mankind. If the enemy plan had succeeded, there wouldn't have been an Israel who knew God, knew God's word at the time when Jesus arrived. How would they recognize Messiah if they didn't have the scriptures? How would they help him keep the promises of God if no one knew what the Bible was saying? It was a time of great peril before the coming of the Messiah, where the enemy was trying everything he could to stop his coming. There was a rebellion initiated by some priests, and they managed, despite against all odds, to overturn the might of the most powerful kingdom in the world at that time, the Assyrians. God was with them. He gave them a breakthrough. He made a way for them. God raised up a deliverer. And when they came to the temple, they were shocked as they found weeds waist high, as they found the idol still sitting in the holy place with its hideous image. They wept. They tore their clothes, and they rededicated the temple to worshipping the one true God. This is a foreshadowing of what is happening in the future. It is a foreshadowing of what I believe will happen. Just as there was a battle for the worship of mankind in the lead up to the Messiah's first coming, so there is a battle for the worship of mankind in the lead up to his second coming. The enemy is trying everything he can, even through the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to stop the preparation for the coming of the Lord. He doesn't want mankind to worship God. He does not want the tabernacle of David to be restored. Even as we are worship leaders, as we seek the Lord, the enemy is opposed to us and trying to hinder us one way or another, because he wants to steal our worship and stop us from worshiping God. Don't let him stop your worship. Don't let him stop the song in your heart. Whatever you go through in life, don't let him stop it. There was a young man who was a youth leader and a worship leader, happily married for only a few months. And suddenly his young wife had a medical emergency. She was rushed to hospital and passed away. And he was shocked, he was stunned. A few days later, as he was seeking the Lord about it, he saw a picture of himself before the crossroads. One road was going down a path of bitterness, and he would see himself as a bitter man at the end of that road. And he saw another path heading towards worship, heading towards worshiping the King of Kings. And he decided, I'm going to worship. He went to the church building that they had, and he sat down at the grand piano and started to worship the Lord. You see, the enemy tries to hinder our worship, even through things that happen, a surprise attack of the enemy to stop us from worshiping him. And sometimes we let it stop us. We let the questions overwhelm us. Why, God? Why did that happen? But we're called to worship him anyway. And as we worship him, he will comfort, he will answer, he'll restore, he will heal. But if we hold on to those questions, say, God, I don't understand. God, why do you do this to me? Then the enemy has succeeded in his plan to stop the worship of our hearts. He has succeeded in turning us away from the one true God, to focus on ourselves and our own pain. God is calling us to worship him in difficult times and in good times, because he is worthy of praise, no matter what you're going through. He is worthy of praise. If you're struggling with sickness, he is still worthy of praise. He is still the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And as we minister to him in worship, he'll minister to you. He'll move in your life as you call out to him. But don't just call out to him for yourself. Just worship him for who he is. And as you do, he will move in your life. The answers to the prayer I've had in my life have often come at a time of great difficulty where I've worshipped the Lord anyway. And there God has met me in a special way. Worship him. Worship him in the difficult times and the good times, because he is there. He is looking for worshippers. Every day he is looking for someone who will call on his name. Let's go to the future battle for the temple. The story of Hanukkah was amazing and traumatic for Israel. And just like the Holocaust has been a trauma for the nation, so Hanukkah would have been a trauma for the nation of Israel at that time. It was not far from the surface, not far from the memory of the Jewish people. And Jewish listeners would have been shocked, I believe, when they heard the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verse 15. Matthew 24, Jesus is asked about the end times. He is asked about what it will be like. He warns about deception. You know, we are in a day and an age where there's so much information. We could say, no, nobody is deceived. We are getting all the information we need. But Jesus warned that in the last days, in the information age, there'll be great deception. He said, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, and false prophets will arise. And the love of many will grow cold because of the lawlessness, because of the sin going on. There will be tribulation. There will be persecution. Be ready for it. There will be persecution. It's not just for those out there. Unfortunately, it can be, and I believe we have to be prepared, that it can be for you and I as well. There will be persecution. Many will hate you. But in verse 15, or verse 14 first, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world. It is a time for us to take the gospel out. It is a time for us not just to be aware of what is going on, not just be watching the news, but we are to go out with the gospel. We are to go and to make a difference. We are to go and make disciples of all nations. This is the time for us to be mobilized to action like never before. And the gospel will go out to all nations during this time. But in verse 15, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place, he who reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. It's almost as if he is doing a reference to the story of Hanukkah here, but he's assuming that people will know Like if today we speak about the Jews going to gas chambers, we all know what we're talking about. We're talking about the Holocaust. We say, hey, you'll understand what I mean when I say Jews going to the gas chambers. And here he is saying the abomination of desolation. You'll know what I mean because it had just happened. It had just been not long ago. He's saying, when you see it, then flee. Why? Because at the time of Hanukkah, that was when the persecution broke out, when this idol was erected to worship another god, to worship this Antiochus Epiphanes in the temple. Then the persecution broke out across the land. And his warning of a similar thing happening again, when you see it, again, then let those who are in Judea flee. And in verse 21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world. Then there will be great tribulation. As that arises, as that situation happens, there will be a release of great tribulation on the people of God. We'll go to 2 Thessalonians as well, briefly. Second Thessalonians chapter 2. Paul the Apostle is again describing the end times. And again he begins with a warning about deception. In this time of information, he's saying, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. Remember, many were falling away at the time of Hanukkah. They're falling away from the faith. And he says that this is happening again. Many will fall away. And the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. So this man will arise. In verse 4, he will oppose and exalt himself above all that is called God, or that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. It's a repeat. He is sitting in the temple. We know that the priests, they could not sit. They would always be running around, they'd be walking around. They were forbidden to sit because their work was not complete. But here is a man who sits in the temple as if he has everything under his control, and he says, worship me. He shows himself to be God, just like Antiochus called himself God-made man. So this person as well will be demanding worship. Every year the Jewish people are celebrating the Feast of Hanukkah, and my prayer for them is that they will move beyond the candles that they light, the songs that they sing, to hear the message of this story, that they'll be aware and alert when there comes pressure on them to sign a treaty, when there comes pressure on them to compromise the ways of the world. It is a repeat of what happened at that time. We have covered the past, we have covered the present, we have looked briefly at the future battles of the temple. How close are we to the return of those days? I believe we're getting closer. Slide 12. Israel's looking for alliances and security. There is a growing intolerance in the world today of biblical values. Even our Premier was recently talking and saying that this is 2015, not 1815. What he meant by that was that the values of the Christian society of 1815 are outdated and should be dealt away with. Today we need to have new values and a new standard, which is influenced by the thinking of the world and is strikingly similar to the time of Hanukkah. There's rampant immorality in the Western nations and in Israel itself. There's a pervasive Hollywood culture affecting all of us. Interestingly, during the time of Hanukkah, there was a promotion of abortion in a different way than we do today. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, was saying you should put out any child born with a defect. Put them out in the forest and let them die. Today we're seeing the same thing. When my mum was pregnant with me, being 40 years old, her first child, the first question straight away from the doctor is, will you keep it?